going to tweet it out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you? I can. I mean, I can do it on my phone. Here, I got it.
Okay.
Except for I don't have it.
You don't have
Okay,
FMEPs?
I don't have FMEPs.
Okay, give me a second. I'll tweet it out.
You can. I'll just retweet.
Try again? You have to unmute it.
All right, we're going to get started. Unusually, we all seem to be here early. I feel like we're running late, and it's actually exactly 12:30. So well done, all of you and all of us. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Laura Friedman. I am the president of the foundation. Thank you for coming today. My name is Laura Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. We're very happy to have you all here today for a discussion on Gaza. And the title is 1 Year After the Start of the Great Gaza March, What is Next for Gaza? We are very happy this event is co-sponsored by Americans for Peace Now and J Street. And actually, before we go further, I'm going to ask my friend and colleague Holly from J Street to just come up and give a shout out for an event that they are doing.
Thank you. I am Holly. I work for J Street. It's great to see many of you. I just wanted to quickly plug and ask that everybody mark their calendar on Sunday, March 31st. J Street, along with New Israel Fund and Americans for Peace Now, and 18 other plug and ask that everybody mark their calendar on Sunday on a memorial for Omar Baddar. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his writing. We're excited to memorialize his life and legacy. The event will feature remarks from Roger Cohen from the New York Times, Tania Hary's daughter, a video address from actress Natalie Portman, and many, many more. So if you're available to join us on Sunday, March 31st at 3 p.m. at Temple Sinai, I hope I'll see a lot of you there. Yeah, that's all.
And I think I misspoke just to say this event is co-sponsored by J Street and the New Israel Fund. So thank you for coming. We're going to quickly turn this over to our illustrious guests. All the way from Tel Aviv is my friend Tania Hary, who is the executive director of Gisha, which is the legal center for freedom of movement. Gisha does work that nobody else does and is irreplaceable on Gaza issues, and she is, I would argue, probably the preeminent expert on questions related to movement and access from Gaza. She is joined by my friend Omar Baddar from the Arab American Institute. Omar is the deputy director there. He is in his own right also an expert on issues of Israel, Palestine, and on Gaza. So we look forward to a rich discussion, and when they are ready, they will open it up for Q&A, which they will manage. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. And thanks to all the sponsoring organizations and to Kristen for putting this event together, and to Tania for being here as well. I was planning on giving a general overview about what's happening, sort of some stats about what's happening in Gaza, but Tania was kind enough to bring one of these. So do you know if they've been distributed to?
They're just on that table there.
So they're sitting up on the table. Be sure on your way out or in if you want to grab one to sort of get an overview of what life is like for Palestinians in Gaza. There are some useful statistics in there. In terms of, this event is commemorating the upcoming anniversary of the March for Return that was launched a year ago in Gaza. But there are a couple other anniversaries. Of course, many of you know that today is the 16th year anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. And just 4 days ago was the 16th anniversary of the killing of Rachel Corrie, who was an American activist from the state of Washington, who was killed by an Israeli bulldozer while she was protecting Palestinian homes from demolition in the Gaza Strip. And one of the hopes that Rachel Corrie had was for a better future for Gaza. And here we are 16 years later, where the future has not improved, and basically we don't see many signs of hope in the foreseeable future for how Gaza can improve. We have had since then Gaza being placed under a siege, we've had multiple military assaults that have been absolutely devastating to the population in Gaza that have led to the killing of thousands of people, including hundreds of children. And we are in a situation where 90% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable, where unemployment figures are over 50%, and for youth, which is the majority of the population in Gaza, it's even higher than that. And Tania, before we talk about the current situation, I'm just curious if you can tell a little bit, just to provide context of sort of the angle that you come from, if you can talk a little bit about the work that you and Gisha do related to Gaza.
Sure. It's great to be here. I want to thank everyone for coming and thank the sponsors for putting this together. I think it's a really timely event, and I'm grateful that you took out time from your day to be here on a subject that, of course, is not easy to talk about and to hear about. So the work that Gisha does is related, like you've heard, to Gaza and freedom of movement. The word Gisha means access or approach in Hebrew. And we're an Israeli human rights organization based in Tel Aviv. We have about 20 staff in Tel Aviv, and we have a field worker who's based in the Gaza Strip. Now, our day-to-day work is providing legal assistance to individuals from the Gaza Strip or people who need to go into the Gaza Strip. So we're helping them navigate the bureaucracy of getting a permit from the Israeli military to cross into or out of Gaza, and also to move goods. Recently, in the last few years, we've added that to our legal program. So we help about 1,000 individuals per year through that legal assistance, and we're also looking for cases where we can try to create policy change generally when it comes to movement and access. In addition to legal assistance, we do what we call legal advocacy, especially trying to promote transparency of policy using the Freedom of Information Act in Israel, which is one of the very robust tools that human rights organizations can use in Israel to uncover information about policy. And we also do research, produce reports, videos, animations, social media, regular media work, meetings with decision makers both in Israel and abroad. And the idea behind the organization, we were founded in 2005, just ahead of the disengagement. So when Israel pulled its military installations and settlements from the territory. And the idea really was to look at what Israel's ongoing obligations would be to residents of Gaza in this unique situation that was created. It would no longer be an occupation exactly like there is in the West Bank. It would be something different. We didn't know exactly what it would be. But you didn't really have to be a fortune teller or have any special talents to know that control wouldn't necessarily be relinquished. It would really just be reconfigured to the borders. And that the main way that control continues to be expressed today, so many years later, is around movement and access. And movement and access, of course, is a precondition to the fulfillment of a host of other rights. So health, education, family life, a number of different things, of course, that people need in their normal lives that I think people who have freedom of movement, like you and me, we tend to take for granted. Of course, freedom of movement is the key to all of those things. So our work has a multiplier effect in allowing people to reach family, medical care, education, job opportunities, to move their goods, to engage in trade. That's in a nutshell.
Great. So
yeah.
I know that a lot, there's very commonly the excuse that Israel uses for the siege on the Gaza Strip is security justifications. Now, I think we know that that's not true when you consider that for periods of the blockade, even basic goods like potato chips and cookies and sodas were not allowed in.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious if you can give a little bit of background, sort of your analysis on what you think is actually driving the blockade, Israel's blockade of Gaza Strip, and sort of what that blockade looks like currently in practice and what sort of things are allowed in and not.
Sure. So from our analysis, I think that there are, if I can sum it up, about 3 main reasons why we're in the situation that we're in today vis-a-vis Gaza. Now, one is security. I don't deny that, and I want to put that out there. I know that human rights organizations often get accused of overlooking legitimate security needs. I don't think that's the case. I think that we are focusing on human beings, but we don't ignore the reality and the context that we're living in. So I do think that security is one factor. However, there are two other factors which are really important to the story. One is political goals. So you're alluding with the ban on things like potato chips, children's toys, et cetera, to the policy that was put in place in 2007. When Hamas came to power, what we say is that the closure didn't necessarily start, it was simply tightened then, because movement restrictions had actually started long before then. Even as early as the 90s, ironically with the Oslo process, which created the permit regime. And then over time, kind of being implemented more and more with the start of the Second Intifada, with the disengagement, with the 2006 elections, and culminating in 2007 with the takeover of Hamas. And at that time, Israel made a decision. It was articulated in a Security Cabinet decision in September of 2007 that said we're going to put restrictions on movement of people and movement of goods, and not just tied to legitimate security reasons, but for political goals. The idea was to put pressure on the civilian population or on Hamas, depending on various articulations that were made. They called it economic warfare, sanctions, this kind of thing. And so really the idea was to put pressure generally on the population to reduce economic activity on purpose. They've called it a policy of separation, which in Hebrew can mean both differentiation and separation, and it's been used in both senses of the term. In the one hand, separation of physical isolation of Gaza from the West Bank, and also a differentiation. So in theory, kind of pushing the quality of life down while lifting it up in the West Bank so that people would say, next time, you know, we're going to rise up against Hamas, we're going to vote in elections differently, et cetera. So clearly political goals, we think, is the second reason. There have been some policy changes since then, but overall the framework is the same. And I think the third reason, which is vastly overlooked, is the question of accountability. Israel doesn't see itself beholden to residents of Gaza in the way that we would think they are. Their view of the situation is that they're obligated to a certain minimum humanitarian kind of standard. They would be obligated to allow convoys of humanitarian aid, et cetera. But they don't see themselves as obligated to allow a higher standard of living. And if they are allowing beyond that, which you can say, of course, that they are, I'll talk in a second about what the policy looks like today. They're only doing that out of the goodness of their own hearts. I mean, out of the interests that they might have to do so, out of pressure from various populations, from the international community, et cetera. It's not because at the heart they say, this is what the law obligates us to do. And I think that overlooking that important aspect of the policy really puts us at a disadvantage when we're analyzing what's happening. Because what it means is that we think it's not doing the proper balance between legitimate security needs and the needs of the civilian population. In a normal circumstance, in a state of even conflict with a territory, you would need to look both at your obligations to the civilian population and also your security needs. And we think that that kind of balance is not being done properly. So that's the general analysis that we have of why we're in the state of affairs that we're in. And I'm happy to take questions if anything is unclear. In terms of what the policy looks like today, I'll just say in a nutshell, there are criteria for who can apply for a permit from Gaza, and that would mean to travel to the West Bank or to Israel. Israel controls all movement between Gaza and the West Bank because even if a person travels out through Egypt, they need a permit to enter the West Bank even from Jordan. So all travel between the two areas is controlled by Israel, and of course access into Israel is also controlled. Now there's the Rafah crossing to Egypt, and we can talk about that. But in terms of the criteria for movement of people, it's quite narrow. So the official policy is exceptional humanitarian cases with an emphasis on medical treatment. So people can travel, for example, if they're looking to reach medical care that's not available inside of the Gaza Strip, they can travel to visit a first-degree relative who lives either in Israel or the West Bank, who, I'm sorry to say it so bluntly, but is either dead, dying, or getting married. Those are the only categories, and that's a first-degree relative. And they can travel also in some other circumstances that have been added to this list of criteria over the years. And if you talked about things that are arbitrary, there are a number of things on this list which are quite arbitrary. For example, the Palestinian national soccer team, the national football team, is on there, on the criteria, in black and white. And the reason for this is because Israel has been afraid of penalties by FIFA if it doesn't allow those players to travel. So you can see in the criteria itself that there's a limitation already on who can apply for a permit. It's not related necessarily to whether a person poses a specific security threat. On movement of goods, Israel allows most goods to come into the Strip except for a long list of goods it considers to be dual use. And that includes items that are needed for construction, for industry. Now, it's not a blacklist. A person can apply for a permit to get those items in. It's quite difficult to do so. In terms of what can come out, so there was a ban on exit of goods from Gaza to Israel and the West Bank that was in place from 2007 until 2014 and 15 for Israel. And you can ask yourselves, what happened in 2014 that would have changed this policy? Hamas didn't disappear. They didn't stop firing rockets. These ostensive goals behind the original policy, ostensibly should have still been in place. But there was pressure after the last military operation to accelerate some economic activity. And suddenly what had seemed totally impossible, that tomatoes from Gaza would go to the West Bank, or even tomatoes from Gaza going to Israel, suddenly was possible. So when there was political will, suddenly there was a way to change the policy.
It's funny because sort of my read on the fundamental driving force of this policy is when you look at the settlement withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, it was immediately met with an expansion of settlements in the West Bank. So at no point was it really an attempt at shrinking the occupation. It was more of a redistribution of the occupation to some extent. And I think that Israel's interest in not making the case for withdrawal from the West Bank led to the Gaza policies in the sense that if a withdrawal from Gaza led to a successful, flourishing society in Gaza, then the pressure would be, well, this is working, why don't you now pull out of the West Bank in accordance with international law and facilitate that process, which I think the Israeli government was opposed to. So that's my sense of sort of the policy of the siege and making sure that the political tensions continued, the prospect of violence continued, and that basically there was no chance for normal life to proceed. But I'm curious.
Can I just stop and
Sure.
say I agree with you on that, and I think that there's another issue which you're alluding to, but maybe it's not as clear. I mean, I do think that we're also talking about a demographic calculation. So it's no secret. I mean, maybe a few years ago, I would have looked like a conspiracy theorist to mention it. But now it's out in the open that there is a demographic concern with, if Israel or parts of the Israeli government would like to maintain control of the West Bank, then they need to shift the demographic balance in their favor. The U.S. ambassador has gone on record saying we removed 2 million Palestinians from the equation. He meant Gaza residents. And so I do think that there is an interest in keeping Gaza and the West Bank separate. Now, of course, Palestinian actors, I think, are contributing to this in a very unhelpful way. But it starts, I think, with movement policy. Because one of the things that we're looking at is how do you build progress, or how do you make progress in a political stalemate? And we know personally from our work about thousands of people who would like to travel back and forth for regular reasons, whether it's family ties. About 30% of Gaza residents have family in Israel and in the West Bank. Whether it's civil society organizations, which traditionally had operated in both parts of the Palestinian territory as one organization, women's rights organizations who would like to make change in their national politics, and who are prevented from doing so because it's hard to work between the two parts of the territory. The economy, which struggles to function in this split of movement restrictions. So we think that if Israel were interested, it could allow a foundation that would build a kind of a better basis for reconciliation and a better basis for, I think, future cooperation between Gaza and the West Bank.
So I want to open it up to the audience, but I have one final question on this. Your organization works both in terms of helping individuals get permits and also on a broader policy front. We have Israeli elections coming up, and I'm curious how that impacts your work, and as part of that, sort of what your read is on the election and its potential impact on Israel's relationship with Gaza. Because I can speak certainly from, most Palestinians, I imagine, and Palestine advocates are very dismissive of the idea that policy could change, but I'm just curious if you have a different perspective on it.
I tend to be a fairly optimistic person, so I always tell people to take what I say with a grain of salt. I don't think I'm a very good analyst because my analysis is sometimes skewed. So, I'm scratching for a way to look at what could be positive in these elections, and I have to say I'm coming up rather short. I do think that, it has been true that successive Israeli governments, whether on the center or on the right or the center-right or even center-left, have continued these policies. We haven't seen major shifts. So I can't say that I'm terribly hopeful. I do think, and again, maybe for an outside audience, it might seem ironic that sometimes military officials can be more pragmatic than politicians in Israel, and military officials, security officials have been sounding the alarm on the situation in Gaza. They've been saying the situation is unsustainable, it's not good for Israel. And so I think this coalition of former generals, ironically, it could be that there would be some openings in terms of small policy changes. I think generally the calculus in Israel is that nothing can be done in the near future and that we're just here to manage a bad situation. So I don't see anyone being terribly creative, terribly brave, showing real leadership in terms of creating real change. But again, I'm optimistic, so maybe I'm just, going to hope for the best.
All right, shall we take some questions from the audience? Are we going to use the mic in the back? Yep.
You point to an operator.
Sure. Any questions? All right, I see one right there. Yep, so two, we can take them one at a time.
Hello. I have some questions on everyday life back and forth.
Yeah.
You could just address them in any order you want. First of all, water to West Bank, Gaza, etc.
Okay.
That I understand continues to flow, somewhat uninterrupted, but I don't know the details. Trade, labor from especially the West Bank into Israel on a daily basis. I remember that they were citing numbers of daily crossings for lower job, blue-collar labor, and I guess, is that continued? Is it growing? Is it cutting back, et cetera? And then as far as visas or visitors from other countries or travel groups, because I know another issue is tours that go to Israel, some are saying, well, do we also get to visit the West Bank, et cetera? So.
Okay. Are you going to help me remember them?
Yep.
Okay.
That was multifaceted. So it was
Okay,
dealing with
water.
Yep.
Okay, we'll start with water.
Yep. So
Yeah.
there's water, there's labor rights, and back and forth movement of people and people visiting in.
Yeah.
Yep. Were those the three main things?
Okay, I really like your questions. We produce a ton of information and graphs and lots of numbers, so I'm not going to bore everyone with those things, but the data is available. Just to say a few words, really, in terms of the water situation, so in Gaza there is the water aquifer. It's the groundwater that's available to Gaza. About 96% of it is unfit for drinking. There's over-extraction, there's salination that has kind of seeped into the water, there's pollutants, et cetera. One of the main problems with access to water in Gaza is, of course, the energy crisis. So it depends on how the various sources of energy are working. There's energy that is purchased from Israel, energy that's produced at the power plant. some that comes in from Egypt. And depending how much electricity there is, it affects the availability of water to people's homes, water that's available for agriculture, and also the ability to treat sewage in Gaza. So right now, we're in a brief window of time where the situation is better than normal. The Qatari government made a donation for purchase of fuel that's coming in from Israel for the local power plant. And so you have about 12 hours of electricity available per day. It's running in cycles of about 8 hours. So 8 hours on, 8 hours off, 8 hours off, on. So over and over again. And so you have more water that's available to homes, but not that much more. You still have households that are receiving water only every 3 to 4 days, sometimes even more than that. The way that people get around this terrible situation is, of course, to purchase water. So they're purchasing water that is desalinated in local facilities. They're also purchasing trucked water. They're getting water as charity, as handouts. Some water is also being purchased from Israel. What's done is it's mixed in with the local water supply to make the water in the taps a little bit better for use. It still can't be used for drinking, but it can be used for washing and things like that. So that's in general the water situation, not a good one. When it comes to trade, in terms of movement of goods, you have a situation where currently today, there are fewer truckloads of goods going into Gaza than were going in 10 years ago, even though the population has grown. And the main reason for that is lack of economic activity. So part of it is the restrictions on what can enter on construction materials, which has traditionally been about half of the incoming goods. So we saw a rise after the last military operation when people were rebuilding their homes. But generally speaking, it's lower than it was 10 years ago. When it comes to outgoing goods, also, there are still restrictions on what can go where. So not everything can go out of Gaza. And so you have about a 20% rate of the numbers that were going out in 2007 before the closure was tightened. About 200 truckloads of goods exiting Gaza per month. So 200 truckloads for a population of 2 million people. They're carrying about 80% agricultural produce. Gaza's very well known for its strawberries, tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that. There is also something kind of curious coming out, scrap metal. So there are very few products that are allowed to go to the Israeli market. The Israeli market was one of Gaza's main markets before the closure was tightened, and only a few products can go to that market now. Tomatoes, eggplants, this scrap metal, and also textile and some furniture. Now, why tomatoes and eggplants? Are they less threatening than strawberries or cucumbers? No. There was just a shortage on the Israeli market, and so these products were allowed in, again, to point to the kind of arbitrary nature of the policy. Scrap metal as well. There was a buyer in Israel that was interested in getting scrap metal out, and literally what is happening is you have old washing machines and other appliances being shipped into Gaza, using cheap labor in the strip, being taken apart and being sold out of the strip in these boxes of scrap metal. Now, if you can find a mechanism to screen scrap metal, I mean, I've been down at the border and seen it, it's literally like piles of junk, then I think that there could be a way to get products that are banned from going out, like olive oil, which we've been trying to help a company get out, cookies, biscuits, more kinds of agricultural produce. I think that really, again, we're talking about the political will that's not there to find solutions to those things. In terms of labor flows, just quickly, there are no laborers going out of Gaza into Israel, at least officially. Prior to the start of the Second Intifada, you had about 26,000 laborers coming out of Gaza. The number of exits from the Erez crossing was about 500,000 per month. We're now at 2.5% of that rate of people traveling out of Erez. On a good month, we're looking at 12,000 exits. 15,000 was in the year 2015. So very, very small numbers. When it comes to the West Bank, there are, of course, laborers entering the Israeli market. I mean, it's not the subject of this presentation today, but you have upwards of 100,000 laborers who have permits and tens of thousands of more who are entering illegally for work inside of Israel. So there have been some discussions about perhaps allowing laborers to come out of Gaza, which we think is vital. The only way forward is to create more jobs. There has been talk about something like 5,000 people, but it hasn't happened yet.
So I saw a hand raised there.
Mm-hmm. She should call us. Yeah, she should call us. So Gisha was instrumental in overturning a ban on access for students going abroad. Actually, in the year 2008, we exposed the fact that the U.S. had canceled Fulbright scholarships to students in Gaza because the U.S., Israel's biggest ally, couldn't get 7 Fulbright scholars out of the Strip. This did lead to a change in policy. It allowed the Fulbrighters to get out as well as other students with scholarships. And most recently, we also contributed to removal of a ban on undergraduate students getting out of Gaza. So graduate students and undergraduate students, there's a mechanism for them to actually transit out of Israel via Erez crossing through Israel, through the West Bank and out to Jordan. And from Amman, they can fly abroad. Of course, Rafah crossing is open. It's also an option. Students can apply or register, to travel out of Rafah if they prefer to do that. There is a policy by which if you travel out of Rafah, you need to return via Rafah. So many people are cautious about using the crossing for fear that the crossing will close and they'll be trapped. It's also dangerous, of course, to travel through the Sinai. But students, the main obstacle that they do continue to face is that when they apply for permits, there's a processing time for permit applications that is insanely long. It's about 70 business days long. So what that means is that if you have a visa, an entry visa to a country that's valid for, 2 weeks or a month, then that's not enough time for you to apply for a permit. So what we've been trying to do is get the Army to consider the fact that these students have visas that are not long enough to deal with this permit processing time. So.
Thank you for remembering Rachel Corey. I wanted to ask, when the March for Return started, it was very much a grassroots movement, and then there was commentary, right or wrong, that Hamas had taken it over in some places, and I wonder, as we approach the anniversary, what do you see happening?
Yeah. I think that, obviously Hamas is very influential in Gaza, and they have the ability physically to stop the protesters and not. I do think, though, that it's important to keep in mind that this did start out as a grassroots movement and that youth in Gaza and young people particularly have really lost all hope. So, you don't need to do much to get people to go to these protests. In fact, I think that, we can probably say safely that the vast majority of them are going, because they believe that this is what they should be doing. Over the last year especially, we've seen things that we haven't seen before. I have actually been working at Gisha since the year 2007, so I've seen a lot of these waves of different events, 3 military operations. I mean, of course, from the vantage point of Tel Aviv, not from inside of Gaza, but, I've been looking at this situation closely for a long time. And, it's this kind of stereotype that Palestinians are resilient. I think human beings in general are resilient, but everyone has a breaking point. And I think that what we've seen over the last year has been the breaking point. It's a society that is buckling. When you have, 70% of the population is under the age of 30, 70%, that's 1.4 million young people. A little over 50% are under the age of 18. If they don't feel hope for the future, if they don't have job prospects, if they don't feel that investing in an education is going to be worth something, that's a recipe for instability. It doesn't matter where in the world. It doesn't matter that Hamas is in power. It's a recipe for instability anywhere. And so I think that it's really important that we see these young people, that we see their, essentially cry for help, their cry to be seen by the international community. And the fact that essentially they know what fate awaits them at the fence, and they're still going. I think that it's a very sad kind of statement about the state of affairs.
If I can jump in on that real quick as well. When you look at the situation at the border where unarmed people are going and that you have the gunning down of journalists and medical personnel and so on, this is not the sort of thing that people do for political theater purposes. The costs are very high. Now, there's no question that Hamas is capitalizing on that protest movement, right? They wanted to jump on board. They wanted to be a part of it because they know it's a popular movement. At the end of the day, whether Hamas is willing to hold people back, if you look at the arrangement that Israel has with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, it is a relationship by which life becomes easier for the elites, and they're empowered to some extent, and they're allowed to have the ability to, Israel gives them basically the ability to act as an authority, and in return, that authority provides security for Israel by ensuring that there is no disturbances coming out of the West Bank. I think Israel's aim ultimately is to, if they can get a situation that is similar to that in the Gaza Strip with the Hamas Authority, they would go for it, and I think that allowing some of this aid in the Qatari donation that made it in is part of that. But ultimately, I think Hamas understands that the reason why people turned away from the Palestinian Authority was precisely because of that type of arrangement, where they were seen as essentially subcontractors of the occupation. And Hamas's entire brand is resistance, and so if they act in a similar fashion, that would mean colossal loss of support for them. At the end of the day, though, they're not afraid to crack down on protesters if they so choose. As we've seen in the most recent protests where Hamas had raised the taxes on a variety of goods and people took to the streets, and Hamas responded predictably by mass arrests and violence against protesters, which were condemned also by human rights organizations. So I just think that all of this is context that is worth considering in that. So I saw a hand up there, and then we'll come back to this side again.
Thank you, Tania, for all of this. In addition to the fuel purchase, which the Qataris facilitated, they were also providing flows of cash to be distributed, presumably in ways that Hamas decided, disguised somewhat as salaries, and it created a bit of havoc in Gaza, and it created political problems for Netanyahu. And I wonder if you could just talk about how all of that played out and where it's going.
There was some pushback in Israel. I was pretty surprised, though, relatively speaking, how smoothly it went over. There were images in the press. For those who don't know, like Howard mentioned, there were donations of cash. I think it was about $20 million, brought in literally in suitcases and distributed inside of Gaza to people who were pre-vetted or pre-selected. It made the news. It looked pretty bad, but I don't think that it got the kind of pushback that you would think it would get. There has been now a slight kind of shift in the strategy, so the money will now be distributed, as far as I understand, by the UN, and these will be people who have been pre-selected and pre-vetted by UNRWA to receive this cash. But I do think, again, it's another, I think, good example of when there is political will to do something that is complicated, it can be done. So again, I would say putting cash in the hands of Hamas civil servants, to me, would seem way more risky than allowing strawberries to go to the Israeli market. And so again, we have to ask ourselves why that is. Why has this government made a decision to give these civil servant salaries, allow the transfer of these civil servant salaries, but not allow the private sector to function, not allow students, for example, to travel to the West Bank? I mean, it feels like over and over again, civilians are paying the price in Gaza more than the de facto authorities.
Maybe we can take multiple questions at once. Would that work? So let's start. I see you in the very back corner. I see you up here, and then we'll do.
My name is Dave Lonsbach, no affiliation. I'm just bringing this out there. Is it possible, conceivable, that we could solve a lot of these problems by encouraging the Arab states in the area, like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, to have the same attitudes towards Jews, Christians, Baha'is, Zoroastrian, Yazidis, women, LGBT, etc., that many of these states want Israel to have towards the Palestinians. It seems like the attitude is Israel's an oppressor, Palestinians are oppressed, but it seems like a lot of the ideology of Hamas, for example, and Hezbollah is not too much about individual freedom any more than a lot of the ultra-conservative consider the conservative Israeli government to be. So I'm just putting that out there. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. I think at a couple points in your presentation, I heard you mention that the Israeli government responded to international pressure of different types, both in terms of FIFA pressure for the Israeli soccer team, and then after the 2014 attack, allowing, I think you said, more people out. I think what I hear you saying is that there are conditions under which Israel will respond to international pressure, and in this country in particular, there are certainly attempts at the highest levels of our government to basically, some would say, outlaw or certainly severely curtail that type of pressure. Could you comment on that, and what type of pressure, or whatever word you want to use, would be effective in your opinion?
We'll take one more. Hands up.
Hi. So my question is kind of like just follow up on this lady's question. When it comes to U.S. administration, and specifically USAID and aid to West Bank and Gaza, and with like all this recent turnover, is there any possibility, because like a lot of infrastructure was like going on, and right now everything is pushed back, and while U.S. government is reassessing their approach towards West Bank and Gaza, are there any other actors or like donors who would be willing to step in to fill up that gap in that area specifically? It doesn't have to be infrastructure, it could be education, peace building, humanitarian assistance, because obviously those people need help. Thank you.
Do you want to jump in first? I'll take it.
Sure. So I appreciate the comment, a kind of like intersectionality question even about the various human rights abuses that are happening around the Middle East and in other places. I mean, I think that there's a ton of work to do. There's no doubt that there are many actors in the region who are abusing their power and who are violating human rights. We're an Israeli organization, so our primary interlocutor is our own government, and I don't feel that that's inappropriate. I think that every society should have its watchdog groups that are trying to hold their government to account. And I think for broader audiences, say in the United States, I think obviously Israel is an important ally. It's an important friend to the U.S. The U.S. cares about Israel's well-being, and I think that it should therefore care about the way that it's behaving regionally and the prospects for for peace, the prospects for having a kind of values-driven policy. So I think that we should very much care about the situation in Israel and in Gaza and in the West Bank and Israel's policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And that's not to say that we shouldn't care about other places. I think that there should be discussions of all those issues. And this particular event, we're here to talk about the situation in Gaza. In terms of the kind of pressure that could be helpful, I mean, I think we need to be somewhat realistic about what can actually happen. I think that in the current kind of constellation of powers in the world, I don't see something shifting dramatically, but I do think that it would be important for other countries, the EU and EU member states especially, to step up as the US has taken a less helpful role. We're unfortunately not seeing a lot of consensus in the EU to make those sorts of moves, but I do think that a lot of countries have more leverage than they think, than they are willing to use to influence the policy in Israel-Palestine. There have been some things that have happened, but again, they're fairly minor in the broader context, and I think a lot more can be done.
So I'll jump in on a couple of things. On the U.S. part, I think that there has been a complete abdication of Americans' responsibility towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it's even worse than that, really. Prior to the Trump administration, the United States was always a biased mediator, right? There was unconditional military aid and diplomatic support for Israel. And never really, beyond rhetoric, there was plenty of rhetoric in opposition to the settlement building and so on, but never meaningful action towards advancing Palestinian rights. In the case of the Trump administration, it went a step further. It now became active participation in Israel's war against the Palestinians effectively and their rights, whether it's granting Jerusalem to Israel without ever mentioning anything about Palestinian rights in the city, shutting down the Palestinian embassy here in Washington, shutting down the consulate in East Jerusalem that was serving the Palestinians, about cutting off all aid to refugees, to hospitals in East Jerusalem. All of this is part of a much broader assault, and in the absence of that, I think there are other countries, I agree completely that the EU would be a place where it would be nice to see that responsibility being picked up and taken more seriously. I think it's worth mentioning that in Ireland, there is now a very promising move. There is a Senator, Frances Black. She introduced legislation that has passed both houses of parliament there, calling for a boycott of Israeli goods that are produced in the settlements, saying that if these settlements are war crimes, then the goods from them should not be in Irish markets. And I think that sort of is the kind of lead that more countries ought to be taking after. In terms of broader pressure and efforts to undermine pressure that is coming out, I think this is a very, very critical conversation about the right to free speech in the United States, is that there are bills that are being passed all over the place to try to either criminalize BDS altogether, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is attempting to put pressure on Israel, or make signing an oath, a vow that you do not participate in a boycott of Israel as a precondition to having a contract with your state, even if you're a teacher, even, like just some of the most basic elementary stuff. This is transparently unconstitutional. The ACLU has spoken out pretty aggressively against it. A couple of local courts have already ruled against it. I think one in Kansas and one in Texas, if I'm not mistaken. But these efforts are still ongoing. Those bills are still coming forward, and I think that this is going to be a very critical fight for the right to free speech around this issue. And I frankly see it as a promising sign that Israel sees the potential for this pressure being actually meaningful, that a lot of the pro-Israel forces are taking the drastic step of trying to undermine the First Amendment for the sake of shielding Israel from criticism. And I think that that's where we ought to focus some of our energy. Let's take a couple more questions. I see one in the back, and I see one on the side, and then we'll go that way.
Hi, thank you both so much for taking the time to speak with us. I wanted to return to the comments you made about the recent protests against Hamas in the Strip, and if you think that that's just a blip in terms of Palestinian society, you think it's symbolic of larger trends we might be seeing in Gaza and the relationship between Hamas and the people there.
Oh yeah, at the side.
Since the onset of the Great March, and you talked about its civil society origins, which have perhaps been overwhelmed in this last year by the isolation and desperation and the violence. Could you speak to its intentions in terms of, beyond desperation, to do something proactively in terms of Palestinian unity, which is broken from a civil society angle? Is that still threading through? And actually, the last question, which talked about these recent things, do they have something to do with the quest for Palestinian unity?
And then one last one on the other side.
Thank you two very much. I just finished my graduate studies in Israel and Haifa, so it's a very near and dear subject. My question is kind of in the field of relative deprivation. You have Israeli cities like Sderot that's less than 5 miles as the crow flies from the border. So kind of grounded in that idea, isn't it in the interest of Israeli border security to promote policies that do ease restrictions of movement, as you're talking about, and access? Because especially as you mentioned, almost 70% of the population in Gaza is young. It would seem that these harsh policies that the state of Israel is maintaining for control is going to just breed further generations of enmity. So doesn't it seem sensible that they should promote, if you could just speak on that topic?
Yeah. So in terms of the protests, I mean, I certainly think that, you know, the kind of banner of the Great March of Return was something that all Palestinians can get behind. And I think it was obviously a reminder to outsiders who are looking at the situation in Gaza and who see, you know, I think people on two poles usually. Either you're seeing war or terror, or you're seeing kind of charity cases. And I think that people neglect to see the vast majority of the population, which is, you know, somewhere along that spectrum, but obviously most of the population are civilians, are normal human beings. And I think it was a reminder to people that it's not just about Gaza needing more water. It's not just about more electricity. It's not even just about more jobs. That the economic or humanitarian situation improving is a part of this puzzle, and it's an important part. It's maybe the most glaring part in people's day-to-day life. But overall, they're looking for a solution to the conflict. And from my perspective, that's what I took from it, that the right of return is about recognition of what happened also in 48. It's about not just the occupation of 67. And so I think it's a relevant thing to talk about. You know, Gisha has a certain kind of mandate, but you know, the organizations that are hosting this event have a broader mandate, looking really at what is a good way forward in terms of a resolution to the conflict. And I think encouraging unity, encouraging cooperation, whether it's between Palestinians or between Israelis and Palestinians, is a positive thing, and it should be under the banner of looking for a resolution to the conflict. In terms of the Hamas protests, I mean, I don't have a ton to say about it. I've been in the US for a few days, so I'm following just like you are from far away. I know that the crackdown was very brutal, particularly over the past weekend, with journalists, human rights activists being arrested. Gisha and a small coalition of Israeli organizations, we made a statement about this in a kind of extraordinary way. Again, we're pretty careful about our mandate, but we did feel that this last weekend was a very difficult one, and we stand in solidarity with our colleagues, human rights organizations operating in the Strip in really, really difficult circumstances. I do think it's probably pretty revealing of their anxiety about the situation and what this means, and if the protests could erupt in a broader way internally inside of the Strip. But it's not that new. We have seen waves of protest inside of Gaza, and I think it's also a good reminder of the fact that the kind of strategy that has been behind both Israeli and, I would say, PA sanctions, we didn't talk about it, but the PA has also engaged in some of its own sanctions in the last years, especially this kind of strategy that if we put enough pressure on the population, they'll somehow rise up against the leaders inside of Gaza, it's a flawed strategy, right? Because you have a very repressive government that is not hesitant to use harsh tactics against civilians, and we can't provide any safety to people. The borders are closed, they can't travel. So, you know, I think it's a good wake-up call and a reminder to us to again consider the civilians who are living under three authorities that are not exactly looking out for their best interest, to say it mildly. Is there another question I missed?
The final one was about whether it's in Israel's
right.
best interest.
Yes, I like that question. I'm actually originally from Haifa, born in Haifa, so shout out to Haifa. You know, it's actually a really interesting dynamic. You would think that a lot of people in the south of Israel would be kind of, you know, more angry, more fearful, wanting to maybe even push harder. And actually there are a lot of amazing, amazing people in communities in southern Israel, in Sderot and in the Moshavim, the Kibbutzim, the small towns that are surrounding the Gaza border, who are calling for a different approach. And we're working with them, you know, because they realize, and I think that they know better than most Israelis who are living in other parts of the country don't feel what's happening as much. And people in southern Israel feel it. They're feeling, of course, the rockets that are coming over, the kites that have come over, but I think that they also see Gaza closely, and they know people from Gaza. They remember times that were better when people would come in. They feel even the, you know, missiles and bombs that are falling on Gaza, and I think that, you know, that inspires a kind of a different thinking in many people in the south of Israel. And their voices aren't heard often enough, I think. You know, especially in the Israeli news, they tend to be interviewed in times of escalations. I think their fear is exploited. You know, a lot of empathy comes to them, but, you know, you're not talking with residents in times when they're talking about a need for a different approach. And that's a far less known narrative, unfortunately. But we're working to try to raise up those voices.
And you're really also putting your finger on it when you talk about if then, right? If the goal is more security and so on, then it would make sense to do this. And I think all that highlights is that because that is so obvious, that the goal then therefore has to be something else. And I think that the problem is when there's a driving policy that is not only aiming at security and calm, that there is also a political agenda beyond that to continue the occupation of the West Bank and to find justifications for it. That's why these much more productive, you know, courses of action, attempts to resolve the conflict entirely are not being pursued more aggressively. And just the last thing I wanted to say about Hamas protests. There's no question that the divisions within Palestinian society are extremely problematic, and I frankly don't know what a political roadmap to resolving that looks like, given the depth of the divisions, the fundamentally different strategies involved, and different alliances more broadly, and what, frankly, even regional powers would allow to happen or facilitate or not. But at the end of the day, any kind of pressure that is put on the population of Gaza to rise up against Hamas, they certainly, you know, you do see these protests, and they're taking place, and they're legitimate, and Hamas's response has absolutely been brutal. But the population of Gaza knows ultimately who's besieging their strip and who's carrying out those massive military operations that are bombing them. So a popular uprising against Hamas is not necessarily something that is good for Israel either, you know. And as much as it is difficult for me to put my finger on any way that Palestinian politics could be driven in a better direction, first, me being distant in Washington, D.C., I don't necessarily have my finger on the pulse of people there. And I really just see it as an incredibly complicated situation that I don't know what a roadmap would look like, which is precisely why I think for those of us who live in the United States, there is the much more obvious and simple way to engage, which is on the part that we are responsible for. At the end of the day, when Hamas beats up protesters and locks them up, that's not something that we in America are contributing to as American taxpayers. In contrast to the siege on Gaza and the much broader Israeli violations of Palestinian rights, and the occupation, which are things that we facilitate. And I think as a first step, it makes sense that we would be improving the direction and the prospects for peace is by holding our government accountable for the part that we're engaged in. What time is it now? Let's take a final set of questions. We'll take a last three, and then we'll wrap it up. So we have one in the back.
First of all, I wanted to know about the education and what percentage of the population is actually in school, and up to what grade do they go, and then do they fall off the cliff because they have nowhere to go from there. And then you talk about the First Amendment rights, and we're going down a rabbit hole in the United States with that because of the judges that are being appointed who are going to quash those. So I fear that if Netanyahu is reelected, it is a litmus test here in the United States that here's somebody under indictment and he's going to get away with it. So it troubles me that the similarities between that. And I just don't know how these First Amendment rights are going to be reinforced given the fact that we could have another, God forbid, 6 years of the appointments of these judges who have nothing to do with equal justice.
So there's one in the back there, and then one in the front on this side as well.
Thank you. Hi, Tania. Good
Hi.
to see you again. You and your organization just do terrific work. I wanted to ask you about the jurisprudence that you have to work with. The current government, and particularly the current Justice Minister, have been incredibly hostile to the system that they oversee, in the sense that they have been trying to strip subject matter jurisdiction, they have been trying to pack courts, and politically they attack them all the time. And I wonder if you could comment generally on what impacts, if any, you see in the law that you seek to enforce and the institutions that you have to deal with.
And then one more up here.
I believe you said that you found it encouraging that all the people, not just in Gaza, but the West Bank, are behind what was happening in Gaza with what you call protests, when the head of Hamas said that the purpose, at one point, the purpose is to go and tear the hearts out of the chests of the people in the communities around Gaza. And he even appointed 3 individuals, each to take over one of the communities after they have massacred the people in those communities. What do you find encouraging about all the Palestinians being behind that?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so in terms of the education system, there are 5 major universities inside of Gaza and about 13 additional colleges and technical colleges. So there are higher education options in Gaza. Not a whole lot of master's degrees and very, very few offers of doctoral degrees. So there are some programs that are developing, but really fairly limited options in terms of masters and PhDs. So students who want to study subjects that aren't offered in Gaza's universities tend to go abroad. In the past, they would have gone to the West Bank, but students haven't been able to go from Gaza to the West Bank since the year 2000. So you have those people who are now trying to go abroad. People tend to be very educated inside of Gaza. The literacy rate is actually even higher than the West Bank. It's one of the highest in the world. People invest in education. And I do think that the fact that there aren't very many job prospects is not encouraging, but people are still studying and they're still going to school. The education system in terms of children, you have UNRWA schools being operated for about half of the population, and about another something like 200,000, though don't quote me on those numbers, being educated in the public education system, which is of course being run by the de facto government run by Hamas. So cuts to UNRWA schools result in more kids going to the public education system. The second question, remind me. Justice, yes. So the legal system in Israel. You know, I think that we use the legal system in a way that maybe is different than in other places. I mean, we are pragmatic about what we can achieve. International law is not necessarily discussed in courts of law in Israel, though we will always bring that aspect to our kind of analysis of the situation. Most of our cases are resting on administrative law, looking at what can and can't be negotiated within the confines of the system. So for example, if we were looking at a challenge that we brought last year to the processing times for permits, that it's not feasible, that it's arbitrary, that it's unreasonable to bring those kinds of processing times. If we're looking at helping an individual, then we're trying to read the criteria that have already been defined to say that it's not reasonable to be holding back, for example, a case that we've been fighting for quite a while now, a man who would like to visit his father in the West Bank who had a stroke. And we're arguing with the state about whether the father is sick enough to warrant a visit by his son. So those are the kinds of discussions that are happening within the courts. The judges in the courts, whether at the level of the high court or the district courts, are certainly intimidated. There have been cases where judges have been singled out. You may have heard several years ago about documents that were revealed showing that you know, basically there was a plan for kind of calorie counting to monitor the humanitarian situation by determining how much food should be allowed into the Gaza Strip. That was Gisha's work. We sued the government to reveal information, like I mentioned before, according to the Freedom of Information Act. The state fought us to release those documents. They said that it would harm Israel's foreign relations to release them. And we persisted, and finally those documents were released. A judge ruled that those documents should be released, and she was publicly shamed. And some people even say she, you know, may have had some Supreme Court ambitions that were basically shattered by her ruling in our case. So the judges are under enormous amount of pressure. I can't say necessarily what's in their hearts, but I can say that certainly the external pressure and the environment that they're working in is a difficult one. And yes, Ayelet Shaked, the Justice Minister, has openly, you know, with no shame declared her intention to design or redesign the Supreme Court and the justices of the Supreme Court. When it comes to Gaza, especially, but generally issues related to the West Bank and Gaza, the judges of the Supreme Court don't intervene. That's the kind of de facto rule, that they really defer to the state's opinions, certainly with anything that is related to security, but also things that are related to political rules. So they will, you know, that's the kind of common refrain, is that they don't see a reason to intervene in the decisions. We released an analysis last year of 10 major rulings by the courts, most of them Supreme Court rulings, but also one district court ruling. And that was the kind of analysis, that was the takeaway, was a desire not to intervene. Now that's not to say I think that legal work isn't effective. It's just effective in a different way. We usually don't win our cases, which I think I'm probably not supposed to say out loud. But we do get remedy for people, because we get the remedy on the way to the court. Oftentimes the state will not want to go to court, they don't want to defend a case, they may not have a strong enough case, and so they'll capitulate ahead of time, or they'll negotiate with us about allowing a person to travel. So we are able to help, like I said, about 1,000 people per year. We've had some of these major rulings in FOIA cases, which are helpful. And I do think it's an effective platform. I think it's a really important way of getting the state to defend its policy and sometimes to even articulate it Why is it not allowing this man to go visit his father? I want them to tell Israeli society, I want them to show the world that it's because this man's father is not sick enough. It's not because there's any security claim against this man. That is the policy on Gaza today, and I think it is important that organizations continue to bring cases to the courts, again, knowing what the limitations are. But that's an active discussion in the human rights community, which you may have heard about. And the third question, remind me.
About the statement from a Hamas rep of something
Right.
about crossing over.
Right. Look, I find those statements abhorrent. I, of course, don't agree with any attempts or rhetoric that is calling for harm to civilians. I'm an Israeli citizen. I live in Israel. I'm not a particularly brave citizen. I'm scared, just like everyone else. During the military operations, I was running to the shelters. I think, though, that I'm not asking you not to see those things. That is a reality. That there are people who are saying things that are abhorrent. What I'm asking you to do is to see the human beings who live there. And I would say that the vast majority of the population are children and young people, and they deserve a better future just like Israeli children do. And I think we should be doing all that's in our power to make sure that people are not easily recruited, that they're not hateful, that they are not feeling hopeless about the future. Now, we can't control what is going to happen, but I do think that it's on us to do everything that we can to make sure that we're at least not contributing to economic deprivation, to hopelessness among youth, and that we're removing obstacles to people who want to engage in trade, engage in education, visit family, et cetera. I'm not talking about people going into communities and harming people. I do think, though, that there's also a very, very unhelpful manipulation of those kinds of statements to justify actions which are being taken towards the protesters. The use of lethal force against people who are not posing a threat, who are what Israel has referred to as main instigators, is abhorrent as well. And I don't think that we should be extrapolating on these horrible statements that are made by Hamas officials to justify what's being done at the border to these young people. So I would be careful. I think painting Palestinians with a very wide brush, that people are inherently violent, that they want to strangle children in communities, is racist, and it's not accurate.
If I can jump on that last bit also, there is no, I mean, I'm not familiar with that particular quote that you brought up, but I have no doubt that there have been plenty of horrible things said by people who are affiliated with Hamas. I would just note that there are plenty of equally horrible things that have been said by leaders in the settler movement. There are rabbis in the West Bank who talk about how it's legitimate to kill Palestinian children. You have a follower of Meir Kahane who massacred 29 Palestinians in a mosque in Hebron in 1994, and now the current Israeli prime minister is encouraging the followers of Meir Kahane, the Jewish Power Party, to sort of join his coalition until the Israeli Supreme Court stepped in and barred them from running. So if we can pull out abhorrent things and violent and incitements to violence that have been made by people on all sides, the question is, what do you do about it? And I don't think that it's particularly helpful or useful to focus on these kinds of things. The question is, how do you push for justice so that the people who espouse these kinds of ugly views are marginalized within their own societies? Mm-hmm. And that, to me, comes down to pursuing a real and genuine end to the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. That's about opposing current Israeli government policy. And then when people who live in the Palestinian areas see hope, genuine hope, as they did in the early parts of the peace process, when people were polled early on when the Oslo process began, Palestinians were hugely opposed to the extremists who were calling for violence, in their midst. And I think that once that hope is renewed, once there is any sign that the Israeli government is serious about granting Palestinians their rights, you're going to see people turn against people who make these kinds of statements, and you're going to see these people crushed within their own societies, and vice versa within Israeli society too. Once the prospect of Palestinian violence is removed, you're going to see people who make these kinds of extreme comments be marginalized, and that's ultimately what we're pushing for. We're pushing for peace and justice through better policy, and that's how we get rid of these people.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming out. Appreciate your time.